All right. I forgot to mention this when I first got up to do the announcements, but Helen and I want to thank everyone for the thoughts and prayers and all that for her. We're still not sure what caused her to have an allergic reaction last Sunday, but it seems to have gotten better, so hopefully it stays that way. And yeah, and I'm sorry y'all had to listen to Robbie, but last week. He said he did a good job, so I didn't hear any complaints, but no. No, I appreciate it. So today we're going to be looking at the lesson I'd sent out 2 weeks ago, or the theme, which is more than a show, and this still ties into our forgetting religion and going after Jesus series and idea that we've been following through, and so. I'm going to start out today with, and I'm sure no one has ever met anyone like this, but I'm going to ask the question anyways. Have you ever met someone who looked good on the outside or seemed nice on the outside, but when you got them behind closed doors, they were a completely different person? Anyone ever ran into someone like that? Kyle pointed to Linda. I have, right? And there's that's right. That's a sting. It's a hypocrisy that stings, right? Whenever you think you know someone or you see someone and they put on a really good public face, but then you find out who they are behind closed doors, and that's a completely different person or a completely different type of being. And then, unfortunately, a lot of times that's what religion has become, right? A lot of instances we see where religion puts on a really good public-facing face, but then you find out behind closed doors that a lot of times what's being taught isn't what's being practiced, or what's being pushed isn't what truly is behind the heart of stuff. And so what it becomes then is it becomes a show. And so a lot of times religion is more concerned about appearances, what the public sees, than being authentic. And Jesus was authentic, and that's one of the things that drew a lot of people to him is because of that. And so I'm going to give you an example from my personal life growing up. A lot of y'all know that I was a preacher's kid. And so growing up as a preacher's kid, especially in a lot of the churches we were in, like, I didn't like to dress up. As y'all can tell, I still don't like to. It's just not me, right? I don't feel, and I know everything's not about our comfort, but it's just, that's not who I am. Like, getting in a suit and tie or a dress shirt and tie and all that stuff is just not me. And I think if I started doing that, y'all would be like, "What's up with Chad? Why is he dressing up? Who's he trying to impress?" And so I would have elders and deacons come to me when I was a kid and tell me that I didn't truly, like, I wasn't giving my best, and that if I really loved the Lord, that I would dress up and all that stuff. And finally, I got enough of it, and I told one of the deacons, and I probably shouldn't have done this, especially as a child. I think I was in middle school, maybe high school at this point. And I looked at him and I said, "Tell you what, when your kids start going back to church or going to church, then you can worry about my dress." Because it was all about, his kids didn't go to church. And so you had this, I think it was a deacon at the time, just getting on to me every Sunday about the way I dressed, yet his children were nowhere to be seen. And I was like, where's the hypocrisy in this? Like, but at least I'm here. And he never said anything to me about it again. But that's kind of the ideas and the kind of some of the examples of, we see things of, well, you've got to impress people, or you've got to put on this show, and that's not what Jesus did. And so that's not what we're called to do. And so to transition into this, Jesus saved his harshness. Now, he was always kind of, I would say, needling, poking the Pharisees a little bit throughout his ministry. But in Matthew 23, which is where we're going to be today, he really just spends an entire chapter just laying into them. He calls them all kinds of names. He goes, and we're going to look at all this. And so, because this is not what Jesus was about, and the Jewish religion at that time had turned into, in many ways, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and a lot of them, into a show. It was a performance more than anything, and they burdened people. They burdened those who were trying to follow Jesus with unrealistic expectations, unrealistic rules, and so he he really calls them out on it. And I want to make sure that us as the church, that we don't get caught up in that today, because we can. And I've seen that. I think we've all seen that, where it becomes more about being a show and an appearance than being Christ-like. And so the first thing that Jesus hits on in this, and he calls them out on, and he says, he shows them and talks about how religion is a heavy burden, right? And religion shouldn't be a burden. One of the things we're gonna read into this, but I think it was in Matthew 11, where Jesus tells the people, "Hey, you all come to me, right, and put my yoke on you." Well, you think about back in that day, putting a yoke on people. Well, that's work. And he's like, "What do you mean?" But what Jesus was doing when he told them that, they understood what he was saying, because the religious yoke of the Pharisees was too much. It had burdened them down. And Jesus is saying, "Look, my burden's light. You come to me, and my burden is going to be so much easier than what this religion, what these people are putting on you." And so when he goes into, I have several chapters later in his ministry, when he calls out the Pharisees, he starts off in Matthew 23. And so Jesus says to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses." And so he gives them credit where credit's due. He's like, "Hey, these guys are the interpreters of the law," right? But then he kind of, this is where he deviates from any type of public recognition of them. He says, "So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example." He's like, okay, they get some of the law right. They get what they're interpreting right. So do what the law says, but don't follow what they say, their example, the way they're living their lives. He says they don't practice what they teach. And so he really calls them out on this. He says they crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease their burden. And so the Pharisees were piling rules on people, but wouldn't lift a finger to help them. Have you ever seen that happen in a religious context, or even in a public context, or maybe a work context, where it's just you constantly pile someone? "Oh, you got to do this, and you got to do this, and if you don't do this, then you're not a good Christian. If you don't do this," and so they had, I forget, it was over 600 laws and rules that the Jewish Pharisees had come up with that they had to abide by and try to. Could you imagine if we had a list of 600 things we had to try to make sure we didn't mess up with? It was a combination of, and one of the things I dived into with this, I was looking it up, like, why did they come up with some? Some of it had to do with like the number of days, like some of it had to do with the number of hours in a day, the number of days in a year, like all these things where it was like you were always trying to basically keep a command of God. And so it ended up being this, I think it was 606 commands. I may be wrong on that, but it was over 600 commands that they had put on these people. And basically it was, if you didn't do all these things, if you didn't check all these boxes, then you weren't a good Christian, or at that time a good follower of God, a good Jewish person. And so basically, right, their religion became demands. Right, it was a bunch of demands. They demanded perfection, and it weighed people down. There was no room for grace. There was no room for messing up. It was all that you have to make sure that you do all this. And so, kind of the illustration I thought about here is it really was like giving them a backpack full of bricks and criticizing them for struggling. It's like, here, take this 150-pound bag, and walk with it, and be like, "Oh, well, I can't believe you can't do these things. I can't believe you can't do this." And I really thought about this when applying this to new Christians. Like, I wonder how many people who have been new to the faith that we have ran off, because we, when they become Christians, we expect them to be mature Christians and to do all these things perfectly before they even, we expect them to be able to run before they can even walk. And that's something we have to be careful with, and don't make it, right. So the question I have is, do we make it harder for people to come to God, or do we help them carry their burden? Right? Is it easy for someone to come to Christ in our context, or do we make it difficult? Do we make them have to jump a bunch of hurdles and basically fit into a bunch of expectations or fit into a mold that we've created of what we think a Christian should look like, or is everyone free, everyone open to come and experience Christ in their context, in the way they are, and then get better over time. And unfortunately, a lot of times we tend to expect people to be like, it's like, oh, you get yourself in line, get your life right, and then you can become a Christian. Whereas it should be the opposite. It's, okay, man, we've messed up. You've messed up. You're a mess right now. That's fine. That's okay. Come on in. We'll help. We'll get better together. And we forget that sometimes. And so, go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's the thing. The wonderful thing about Christianity is, like, to come to Christ is just come to Christ, right? You confess Jesus as Lord, and then we got some commands to follow after that, right? But I mean, anyone can, and I mean, you don't have to wash your hands or do anything. I probably didn't wash my hands this morning before. They were like, everyone's like, I'm not going to shake his hand now. But no, it's like, it's like there's no process. There's, you just come. Like, yeah, yeah, and so, I mean, that's who we're to be. And I mean, anyone should be able to walk in those doors and feel welcome and not have to feel like, oh, well, I've got to fit into a certain scenario in order to be here. Well, and I think more than anything, I know I'm framing it around the context of the building, but just being around us in general. I mean, being around Christians in general and how we are out there when we interact with people, right? One of the things we're going to see here in this next point, actually, let me do that. So, because it becomes a show. Right? Religion a lot of times becomes a show, and I'm not trying to knock other religions when you say, but a lot of these things a lot of it's more for performance than it is for reality and actually staying committed. Kyle. Yeah. 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 Well, and I think that's true. I mean, if you, and to your point too on this, like when Jesus was asked that, it's like because there was that was one of the things they would do is the Pharisees and the lawmakers, they would sit around and argue about which one of the 600 commands were the greatest, right? And so they tried to trick Jesus into that whenever they asked him that, because they were wanting to get, okay, well, these guys have been discussing it, and they argued about it all the time. So what does Jesus say? Then we'll argue and we'll pit one side against the other. Well, obviously, Jesus, knowing their heart and their condition, when they asked him that question, he said, the greatest command is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? The second, like it, is to love neighbor as yourself. And so you can't argue. And if you look at the true purpose of and this is where he was pointing out what they had lost. They had lost the intent of these commands, which were loving God and loving your neighbor. Right? You give to you treat people kindly because you love your neighbor, because you love God, right? You give, right? You tithe because you love God. Yeah, you want to give back to God what God's given you. All these things pointed back to one of those two things, loving God or loving your neighbor. They missed that, right? And they had turned it into, they took the love of God and love of neighbor out of these things and basically made it a bunch of commands. Well, anyone can do that. And so it lost its purpose. It's lost its meaning. And that's why Jesus here comes down on them so hard, because, again, it performs for a show. That's what they were doing. They were putting on a show, and we'll see this. And so Matthew 23, 5 through 12. Again, a little bit of these readings are a little bit longer, but I wanted to hit this entire section because I do think it's important. Matthew 23, 5 through 12. He starts out with verse 5. Everything they do is for show, right? On their arms, they wear extra wide prayer boxes with scripture verses inside, and they wear robes with extra long tassels. Now, we're us reading this like, well, that doesn't make any sense. But back in the day, like you would put like these verses, like, how we wear them on our shirts and stuff like that. They would put them in little prayer boxes on their side, and they'd have tassels which represented, I can't remember exactly, they represented some type of work or service that they had done with it. And so basically what they would do is they would walk out with these just ridiculous robes on, with ridiculous like boxes that had like verses on them, and ridiculous. And it'd be like me walking out with like an extra long shirt with like a bunch of Bible verses about how awesome I am, and just trying to show off, or like wearing a cross, but the cross being like this big. I mean, it was ridiculous. They would walk through the streets, and the idea behind it was, look how wonderful I am, look how awesome I am, because I do all. And that's what they had got caught up in. And so he says, and they love to sit at the head of the table at banquets and in the seats of honor in the synagogues. And so what they would do is when the rabbis or the Pharisees would show up, it's like, oh, we have to have this special seat for them at the head of the table when they would come, or they'd give them seats of honor in the synagogues where they sat. So they would set them above everyone else. He says they love to receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplace and to be called rabbi. Don't let anyone call you rabbi, for you have only one teacher, and all of you are equal as brothers and sisters. I wanted to highlight that verse because I think sometimes we skip over this, or we miss this sometimes in the church. No one in the church is better or a higher rank than anyone else, right? Just because I get up here and teach, right, or preach, doesn't make me any better than y'all sitting out there. I struggle with the same sins that everyone else does. Right. And unfortunately, a lot of times in the church, what we've done, we've elevated people in positions like pastors or preachers or elders or even deacons and stuff like that. And we kind of put them on a pedestal. It's like, oh, they're better than us. Right. We're not. Right. Elders aren't better than elders are no better than the person who's a new convert. They should be more spiritually mature. Right. But it doesn't make them any better. So, and according to what Jesus is saying here, we're all equal as brothers and sisters in Christ. We're all level at the cross. No one, you have Jesus up here, everyone else is on the same plane, on the same field. And so we need to remember that. And so when he says this, let me get through a couple of more of these verses, and we'll see this. He says, don't address anyone here on earth as Father, for only God in heaven is your Father. And don't let anyone call you teacher, for you have only one teacher, the Messiah. The greatest among you must be a servant. Now, what he's not saying here is that we can't call our fathers Father and teachers teacher and stuff like that. What he's saying is, don't take these positions and elevate them up, right? Don't make them more important than they are, right? They're a teacher, but we're equal. The rabbis, right, which means teacher, it was a position, right? But he's no better than anyone else, especially in Christ. And so that's what Jesus was getting at when he said calling him Father. Like, obviously, it wasn't like you can't use these words to call people that. It was do not take these people and elevate them up higher than they should be, right? Don't give them like this special service just because of a title that they carry, right? We're all sinners. We're all equal at the cross. And so that's kind of the idea here. And I wrote in my notes here, it says, Jesus' command isn't about vocabulary. It's about attitude, right? Don't seek honorific titles to appear important, right? If someone's wanting to be an elder, like one of the things I've talked about in the church, right? We've kind of messed up the eldership role a lot of times, is because we make it as this role of an important person who's over the church, right? And if you actually look at the role of the elder was the person who was coming behind and spiritually served the church, right? It's a servant role. It's not we've made it a leadership role, but it's a leadership role in the sense that it's a servant leadership role. You're supposed to be coming behind and serving the church, so that way that your flock, in a sense, that the people is mature, spiritually mature and taken care of. And if they're struggling, you're looking after them, right? A shepherd didn't go around and just, I rule over you sheep, right? Sheep don't work that way. They're not a very smart animal. And so you have to serve them. Like the shepherd had to sleep with in the middle of all the sheep, because of, they had to get to know him. It wasn't, oh, well, look at me way up here, you sheep are down here. It's, I'm down there sleeping with these sheep, getting to know them, spending time with them, and they follow me because of it. And so that was kind of the idea that he gave. And so he finishes verse 12, but those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And that was the idea. That is the attitude that we are to have, is don't try to put yourself up in a position of power or authority or look at me, I'm awesome. You should have a humble attitude of a servant, right? Almost the I'm not worthy, not the self-deprecating humbleness, but it's this is who I am as a Christian, as a follower of Christ. I know I'm not perfect, and so I'm going to have that humble attitude in front of Christ. And so that's the idea around religion performing for a show. And that's the Pharisees. The Pharisees love their titles, they love their recognition and that outward appearance, but authentic faith seeks God's approval, not people's applause. And a lot of times, really authentic faith is going to appear less showy. Let me put it that way. It's not going to be the seeking applause, seeking praise, seeking those type of things. If you come across someone who's doing that, then that should be a red flag. Right? Someone who's seeking those type of things, if someone's seeking that type of praise and applause from people, then I would definitely be very, very cautious. That should be a red flag. And so the idea here is, and I think we see this a lot in social media, right? Like if you follow people on social media, what do we put on social media, right? For the most part, there's some who don't, but it's the filtered photos, right? We put the best of how wonderful everything is. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's not reality a lot of times, right? Because we don't put I haven't seen very many of you taking pictures of your child screaming at 8 o'clock in the morning because they don't want to get dressed, right? Or video that, right? It's the good things. It's the wonderful thing. And so we kind of do that same thing sometimes in religion is we put on all the show for the world to see, when truly we've been called to be authentic and to be real with the world and show them our true selves in that. And so the question that I would ask is, who are you trying to impress? Are you trying to impress people, or are you trying to impress God? And that's hard, right? That's a hard thing, because it's our human nature to want to be accepted, to impress people, to be liked by people, and do that. But we got to make sure that our attitude isn't incorrect, and that what we're doing is trying to impress God more than anything. And then the next thing he's going to go to, and I'm going to go through this one quickly because it is a little bit longer section of this, is religion is all talk and no heart, right? and Jesus calls them out on it in verses 13 through 28. It's kind of known as the 7 woes, right? And he goes over one after the other, and I'll read through these real quick, and then we'll talk about it. It says, "What sorrows await you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You won't go in yourselves, and you don't let others in either. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cross land and sea to make one convert, and then you turn that person into twice the child of hell you yourself are." That is a harsh criticism. I mean, he's telling these people, look, You will almost do anything to go across land and sea to convert one person, and you put all that effort in just to make that person, and he literally calls them twice the child of hell that you are. I mean, he's telling them, he's calling these Pharisees children of hell. And so we have to understand the context of what he's calling them today when he calls them. He says, blind guides, what sorrow awaits you, for you say that it means nothing to swear by God's temple, but that it is binding to swear by the gold in the temple. Blind fools, which is more important, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? And you say to swear by the altar is not binding, but to swear by the gifts of the altar is binding. How blind! For which is more important, the gift of the altar or the altar that makes the gift sacred? When you swear by the altar, you are swearing by it and everything on it. And when you swear by the temple, you are swearing by it and by God who lives in it. And when you swear by heaven, you are swearing by the throne of God and by God who sits on that throne. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. And so this is what Jesus was trying to hone in on them. It's like, okay, obeying the laws, obeying the commands of God are important. But if you're not doing it for the right reason, then you've lost the purpose of doing it. There's no point. He's like, yeah, those are important, but what's the most important things? What's more important? And he says, justice, mercy, and faith, right? Are you being just? Are you showing people mercy? Are you being faithful? And if not, then like he keeps continuing to come, then you're just a bunch of blind guys. You're a bunch of hypocrites. You're a bunch of children of hell, as he called them, because you're not faithful. You're just doing this for a show. You're just doing this, to check boxes. And so he really goes after him. So he finishes this with, he says, blind guides, you strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but you swallow a camel. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgent. You blind Pharisees, first wash the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too. And then he finishes this off, and this is really he really insults them here. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly you look righteous, like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. And so he finishes that off with basically comparing them to, which in this day was a horrific thing to compare someone to and tell them what they were full of, was basically their graveyard. He's like, you look, like graveyards look pretty, right? And in this day it was tombs. They would whitewash them and make them look they were actually really pretty, really, really beautiful. But he's like, on the inside, you're full of dead, rotting people, right? Your insides, and this is what matters. That's what matters. He says, what's on the inside. So he's like, if you take care of, like when he talks about the cup, right? Clean the cup, clean the inside, right? And then your outside will be taken care of, right? Take care of what's in here, what's in your heart. And then on the outside, that's what will be taken care of. And so, like I said, this is known as the 7 woes that he calls them. And you have to understand, no one talked to the Pharisees like this. No one would ever dare talk to the religious leaders of this time this way. I mean, these were the top of the top. I mean, this would be like walking into a church building and basically calling the preacher or the pastor and the elders a bunch of children of hell and hypocrites and liars and all this kind of stuff, and condemning them publicly in front of everyone. I mean, you didn't do this at the time. And Jesus, calls him, and this is part of the reason why shortly afterwards they went after him to kill him, because he finally, like, he would always needle them a little bit, but this was the time where he finally, toward the end of his ministry, was just like, he called them out on who they truly were. And so he lets them know, all right, your religion is just all talk. There's no heart, right? There's no heart here. There's no true heart for God in what you're doing. You're just checking boxes, and you don't really care for these people. You're just trying to control them. You don't really you don't really have a care for them. You're just trying to make sure that they check the boxes that you want them to check. And so he kind of explains to them what their religion is, and it's like kind of like a shiny car with no engine, right? You could have a nice Mercedes, you could have a nice Porsche or something, or maybe a really high end Toyota, whatever your car of choice is. But if that engine, if that car doesn't have an engine in it, right? Maybe it's a '56 Chevy. I know that's Dad's, right? But if that engine or that car doesn't have an engine in it, what good is it? It's not going to go anywhere. I mean, you could push it around a little bit if you want to. You get real tired real quick. But that's kind of thing. God doesn't want this. God would rather have a beat up '70s Chevy truck, right? Box model '70 truck that ran than some nice looking car that had no engine. And that's the same thing with us. He would rather see us as being authentic, us in our human nature. We're beaten, we're bruised, we know we're messed up. But God would rather see that and us being authentic and truly trying to follow him than trying to put on some show for the world to see. Yeah. And so finally, he gets to the crux of the matter, and this is the reason for all this, right? What is it about the show? What is it about not having the love and the kindness and the true mercy and justice for people? And what it reveals is, in the end, religion rejects Jesus himself, right? They claim to be following God, but in the end, they're going to reject him. And so he finishes Matthew 23 off with verses 29 through 36. He says, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build tombs for the prophets your ancestors killed, and you decorate the monuments of the godly people your ancestors destroyed. Then you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would never have joined them in killing the prophets. But in saying that, you testify against yourself that you are indeed the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead and finish what your ancestors started." And so, like I said, I'll get into this. This was kind of the transition from where they were kind of going after Jesus, but they decided they were truly going to kill him, because he goes on and says, he's telling them to finish what they started, because he knew what they were going to do, right? They sit there and claimed that, hey, we wouldn't have done that to the prophets. With Jesus knowing full well they were going to put him on a cross. And so, they were going to do exactly what he said. He says, go ahead and do what your ancestors started. He calls them snakes, sons of vipers. How will you escape the judgment of hell? So basically what he's doing, he's condemning them to hell here. In a sense, he's like, how are you going to escape this? Therefore, he says, I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers of religious law, but you will kill some by crucifixion. You will flog others with whips in your synagogues, chasing them from city to city. Now, we can go on and read Acts and all the way through forward and see that everything that Jesus just said here came true. They stoned Stephen. Most of the apostles, except for John, were crucified or martyred somewhere. And so he's letting them know, you're going to crucify me. Go ahead and do what you're going to do. You're going to put me on a cross, and then you're going to go after the rest of these people who you sit there and say that you're going to declaim. He says, as a result, you will be held responsible for the murder of all ungodly people of all time, from the murder of righteous Abel to the murder of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you killed in the temple between the sanctuary and the altar. I tell you the truth, this judgment will fall on this very generation. He calls him. He says, this is what you're going to do. You're going to reject me. And he's calling them out, saying, look, this religion that you're tied to, this performance, this show that you're tied to, doesn't bring you closer to God. It rejects God. It rejects me. It rejects who I am. And so the Pharisees here, they honored the dead prophets, but they rejected the living Messiah. They had Jesus, they had God right in front of them, and they couldn't see. They couldn't see who he was, or they refused to, right? And so religion honors the past, but misses God in the present. It focuses on a lot of empty tradition. It clings to things that are empty, right? A lot of traditions that are empty, but it misses Jesus, who's right in front of us today. And so, because of this, we need to make sure that we put on more than a show, right? One of the things that I try to make sure that we do is that we try to be authentic, right? We don't try to get up here and put on some huge, and I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with putting on a good performance for God. There's nothing in my sense that's wrong with that. But I try to make sure that I stay authentic in what we do, right? Because God called us to an authentic love and mercy and faith. And if we get caught up in things that we're doing because, oh, well, I get attention because I get up here and do this, or I get applause, or I get praise, because if that starts to become your reason for doing things, your focus for doing stuff, you lose focus on God. And that's what the Pharisees had done. They had lost focus on who God was, and their focus became themselves and seeking praise for themselves. And so what the big truth in all this is that God is not impressed with religious performance, right? He desires real relationship. He wants a real relationship with people. And so that's going to be our invitation today. And one of the things that I hope, and I think for the most part, I'm speaking to a group of people here today of y'all really aren't doing this for the show, but for the performance. I don't know that you're really trying to impress anyone, but I still want to give that invitation of forgetting religion, right? And finding Jesus, who, he's the one who frees us from this hypocrisy, right? And he calls us into an authentic faith. And that's really what I'm, kind of calling us to. And so what I want to do is I'm going to do like we typically do, is just give someone, we'll sit and we'll pray and we'll give someone the opportunity to, if they want to come forward if you want to, or you can just sit in your seat and listen and pray to God. But I always want to give that, as much as we can, give that opportunity for anyone to come to Christ, or to seek prayer, or seek forgiveness for anything, to be able to come forward. So we're going to do that now. I'll spend a little time in an invitation to go.
Are you hurting and broken within? Overwhelmed by the weight of your sin? Jesus is calling. Have you come to the end of yourself? Do you thirst for a drink from the well? Jesus is calling. We'll come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was born with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Leave behind your regrets and mistakes. Come today, there's no reason to wait. Jesus is calling.